Shipping is facing serious disruption in the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf from the war in Iran. Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, and in this latest podcast, we will be looking at the legal implications for ship owners that they face in the current situation in the Gulf. And you'll be hearing from Menelaus Kouzoupis, who's based in Dubai with law firm Stephenson Harwood. Welcome to the podcast. Could you briefly introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, I'm Menelaus Kouzoupis. I'm a maritime lawyer focusing on shipping disputes, sanctions and risk issues affecting ship owners, charterers and insurers. A large part of my work does involve advising clients on real-time geopolitical events like conflicts or sanctions which affect shipping contracts, insurance cover and the ability of vessels to safely trade.
I think it's fair to say then you've been pretty busy in the last few days, I'd imagine.
It's been a pretty hectic few days since the escalation of conflict on Saturday. So it's been a real whirlwind and it's such a dynamic situation that things are changing almost by the hour.
Right, well, we'll do our best to cover those for our listeners in this episode. And perhaps we could sort of start by setting the scene. Could you describe the situation we're looking at today in the Strait of Hormuz?
Sure. So following the attacks on Saturday by the US and Israeli forces on Iranian targets, which also ended up killing the religious leader in Iran, there's been retaliatory attacks almost instantly from Iran, not focused just on Israeli assets, but they have attacked a lot of the GCC states on the basis wherever they feel that there are US military assets based. One of the other main escalations, which was always in Iran's arsenal, was to go ahead with their threat of closing the Straits of Hormuz. Now, the Straits, as everyone will know, are incredibly important. About a quarter of the world's seaborne oil and natural gas flows through the Straits of Hormuz. So any action which would impact transit in the Straits will clearly have a huge effect, both on energy and for the shipping markets, and have a prolonged effect which will ripple through the global financial markets as well. So in terms of where we are right now, 5 or 6 days into the conflict, we currently have approximately 1,000 vessels, more or less. And if I use the term stranded, either inside the Persian Gulf, unable to transit out, or clogging up towards the entrance in the Gulf of Oman towards the Straits. The situation is that very few vessels are risking transits, and there have been numerous attacks as late as earlier this morning. So the situation is quite fluid, but currently the straits seem to be de facto closed.
Yeah, because you talked about the vessels being stranded there, and there's a question I keep seeing being asked is the strait really closed?
The straits are an international transit strait under United Nations Convention Law of the Sea. No state can unilaterally close the straits, even during times of war. However, with the very increased threat of military action against any commercial vessel trying to transit the straits, it has become, in my view, so risky to try and attempt to transit the straits that it's what I would call a de facto closure. And we can see that in the numbers of marine traffic. It has come down to a trickle. And of the vessels which are actually risking a transit of the straits, we have seen a number of vessels being attacked by drones. We've seen some spectacular footage, unfortunately, of explosions on vessels being hit by both drones and ballistic missiles. And when you consider a lot of the vessels transiting the straits are gas carriers or crude carriers, it just heightens the risk even more. So whilst they are not legally closed, from a de facto position, they are.
Understood. And yes, those videos, I've seen some of those myself. In terms of, so how has the industry reacted to this? You mentioned about the vessels sat both inside and outside of the strait.
So the shipping industry, due to its very nature, is usually very quick to adapt to dynamic situations. I think almost instantly at the outbreak of conflict on Saturday, we saw vessels stop transiting, clearly aware that the situation on the ground had changed. We've seen some vessels turning back. We've seen major shipping companies, major oil companies and traders already declare that they will not be transiting through the straits. That doesn't deal with the issue of the vessels which are currently there, but in terms of the market, the position has been that they are now treating the straits as closed and are clearly reassessing their risks. The insurance market has been very quick to reassess risks as well. We've seen war risk insurance premiums skyrocket. On Friday, typical premium for additional war risk premium to go to transit the Straits, because it's worth reminding everybody the Straits of Hormuz were a listed area even prior to this conflict, but it with a very different risk profile. Whilst there was heightened tensions due to the situation on the ground, that has clearly changed. So on Friday, typical AP premiums were in the region of 0.01% to 0.05% of whole value. Currently, we are seeing reports that the rates are up to 1 to 1.5% of whole value. And by using an example, on a vessel with a whole value of around 50 million, a 1.5% additional premium would be $750,000. A 0.01% premium would be $5,000. So you can see there is potentially a huge increase, which is understandable considering the risk profile has completely changed in the region.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. Now, if your vessel is, as you put it, stranded currently, who pays for that if it's under a charter?
That's a really good question. Typically, if it's a time charter, the vessel just remains on hire while it's waiting for new orders, which would typically mean that the charterers would be paying. If it's a voyage charter, that could be different, and delays could very well fall on the owners, depending on the factual situation and the contractual position. When the delays are caused by war risks or safety concerns, the allocation of that risk is going to depend very much on the factual matrix and also who is liable under those specific circumstances under the contractual agreement that they have. And it's worth pointing out that in some cases, when you're looking at the factual position, you're also looking at timing. There's a temporal element about when instructions were accepted. So we've had lots of inquiries and we've been dealing with this, as you can imagine, quite a lot over the last few days. And it's quite typical of these types of circumstances. I'd like to think that when there is a crisis situation like this, most parties tend to act cooperatively in the immediate aftermath to ensure that there is safety. And then what you tend to find is a lot of these things tend to work themselves out once the safety concerns have eased, and that's when you start getting into the details of who's responsible for the timing.
So as such, you generally find that people are quite reasonable when you're actually in a crisis situation like this?
Not everybody, but you do find things like making decisions on safety tend to be a little bit more cooperative, because I think it's quite plain to see. Of course, there's exceptions. There's always going to be difficult counterparties. But my experience is typically you just do what needs to be done in the immediate aftermath to ensure the safety of the vessel. And the discussion about who is liable for any delays tends to happen later. There may be reservations of rights and people may say, okay, but we will save this for another day. Typically, that's what happens in my experience.
Understood. But if you get, a particularly unreasonable charterer who insists that you should complete the voyage, what would happen then?
In those circumstances, with the safety of the vessel being paramount, it's the master's decision, the owner's decision, as to whether or not the risk is placing the vessel and the crew in danger. And usually if you have your war clauses, that gives you the right as a vessel owner to refuse orders, which place the vessel at war risk and her crew, and require alternative orders to a safe transit. And the situation would be, if a charterer fails to give you those alternative orders, there are rights for owners to themselves elect to go to a safe port, and they're completely entitled to do so. They're entitled to discharge a cargo even, and all of that would be at the expense of the charterer if they have failed to meet their obligations under war clauses to give safe alternative voyage orders.
Okay. We've seen ships, I think, in what looked like relatively safe locations actually coming under attack. How does that fit with your insurance cover and so forth?
I think one thing we need to appreciate is insurers tend to be very quick to adapt to risk and are very good at assessing risks. Risk profiles are dynamic. So when we're looking at the current conflict, it's not just the Straits of Hormuz. We have seen attacks as far north as Kuwaiti ports, and as far south as Omani ports. They will be looking at the reasons for those attacks. Is it risk profiles of vessels, the flag, perceived ownership? Are they indiscriminate attacks in the region? Are they attacks based on previous port calls, for example? One thing we can say is there is and we've seen this also in the Red Sea, there is some sophisticated intelligence relating to a lot of the vessel ownership. So we have to consider the current situation is one where there will be knowledge from the Iranian side as to who is likely the owner of a vessel. So we can see things like vessels which may be US, Israeli owned or flagged or have a nexus to the US. And not just the US, it could be other allied states, it could be that we've seen that have come out in support. That may have a higher risk profile just by being located in an area which is within range of drones, for example, or missiles. Some of the attacks that we've seen over the past 2 or 3 days, particularly those in ports, the statements that have followed have been that they were targeted not because they were trying to transit the straits, they were targeted due to the ownership interests. So clearly, if vessels with a certain risk profile, it would be, in my view, wiser to avoid the region for the time being. What we're also seeing, which is interesting, vessels which are currently in the region, we're seeing on AIS tracking, a lot of the vessels have been renamed as Muslim-only crew or non-US, non-Israeli interest or Muslim crew. So clearly people are doing what they can to try and differentiate and try and remain under the radar of the forces that are attacking.
Because obviously if you're actually trapped in that region, it's not a choice that you can sort of get out at this point in time, is it?
No, it isn't. And it's worth just understanding that there are a lot of crew who are currently in probably not a great position. And it just highlights the risks of the reality of being in a difficult region and that a lot of these people don't have a choice. There's no easy option. There's no option to just transit out. They're in a region where they're facing attacks. They're seeing attacks on other vessels. And it is worthwhile just remembering and keeping in our thoughts all those crew members who are currently in a very difficult position with no real clear end in sight. So it's very difficult to know how long you might find yourself stuck in the Straits or in the region.
Yeah, an extremely stressful situation to be in.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, sort of looking at some kind of potential solution, there was the idea that came from President Trump this week of providing escorts for safe passage. Is this something that could work?
We've seen escorts work previously, particularly during the Somali piracy crisis, that the escorts work as a deterrent to stop attacks. We're dealing with a very different risk profile here. The issue here isn't an escort to try and avoid attacks from small boats. The issue here is that the closure of the straits are being enforced by various means, drone attacks, ballistic missiles, and also mines. So whilst, yes, of course, having a sophisticated naval assets in the region which can provide anti-aircraft, anti-ballistic missile cover and also having minesweepers is certainly helpful, it's not going to be the instant fix and it won't be as effective as it was perhaps with the Somali situation or in Yemen, where what you're trying to do is dissuade small boats from attacking. Here, the risk profile is very different, and I don't think it's going to it's not going to make it entirely safe.
Yeah, it's a much more complex scenario, and presumably those naval assets are currently actually tied up in the conflict itself.
Yes, and also those naval assets could themselves become targets, and by being close to them would also heighten the risk. It's a very complicated situation because it's such a the straits are very narrow, it's a choke point, and the Iranians have had a very long time to prepare. They've always threatened that they would use this tactic to try and create economic upheaval, but they have never really followed through with the threats. So one of the things which to me is a bit concerning is that they have moved to this quite serious escalation, which in terms of outlook is something that leads me to believe this might not be over as quickly as we may hope it to be.
So you're kind of looking at this situation dragging out for some time with those ships being stranded.
If there's no real movement from or change in the current situation, yes, is the short answer. Of course, we hope that things change. And again, we're dealing with slightly new reality. So some of the soundings that we get from all sides can change dramatically. So my hope is that still within a short period of time, there is some negotiated de-escalation and military objectives are achieved, which allows things to cool down slightly. But we have to wait and see. We get very mixed messages almost on a daily basis. So I think we'll have a better understanding over the next 4 or 5 days as we see what we've been told today is going to be an escalation actually in the conflict. That may hopefully be a precursor to try and reach some sort of a negotiated ceasefire.
Hopefully that is the case. I think just to kind of round out this episode, looking slightly broader at this situation, could you tell our listeners if there are any sanctions or regulatory risks that they should be mindful in this situation?
Of course, there's been sanctions, US sanctions targeting Iran for almost 15 years now. And just to be clear, sanctions that would affect non-US persons, what we would call secondary sanctions. So sanctions against Iran have been in place for US citizens and US companies going back to the Iran embassy crisis. So over the last 15 years or so, we've seen a push from the US to target Iran's energy sector. And those secondary sanctions have been effective in stopping a lot of Western nexus ship owners, for example, trading with Iran, unless either they've got licenses or it's very clear that there are no breaches. The European Union and the UK, they've followed suit, and they are comprehensive sanctions, which I think anybody in the marine industry will be well aware of the restrictions with Iran. And you'd like to think there has been enhanced KYC and due diligence being exercised. And we've been seeing it for a long time here in Dubai, both in London. We regularly advise clients on every voyage when there is potential exposure to Iran. And that could be by just even trading in the region, but they're doing enhanced KYC to ensure that they know who their counterparties are. I think what will change now, because the sanctions are already there, they're already in place. But now that we've had a huge escalation, I think we're going to see, in my view, far more enforcement of those sanctions and much more scrutiny given on any trading that might have an Iranian connection. So we've all heard of the dark fleet, the ship-to-ship transfers that are happening in the Gulf, where there's question marks whether it's Iranian product that's being transferred, disguised as being sourced from one of the other states. I think what we will see following the resolution of this conflict, or even during the conflict, is far more scrutiny being paid to anybody who is deemed to be trading with a country who the US is now at war with. We will probably see that with the UK and the EU as well following suit in order to put far more enforcement on anything which may have Iranian origin. So I would always advise extreme caution. That predates this conflict when dealing with anything that has an Iranian nexus, to ensure you know who all your counterparties are, that you've got it documented, that you've checked, you've been advised that there are limited sanctions risks. And there will never be an Iranian trade which doesn't have a commercial risk, at least. Even if there are no sanctions risk, you may still find yourself in an Iranian port, for example, which requires security to put up by a ship owner, but just not going to be able to do it. So there are, notwithstanding the commercial risks, and I think the industry has been quite experienced in dealing with Iran and taking care to make the necessary checks. I think my headline point will be, expect far more enforcement and scrutiny moving forward. And I would suggest that anyone who does any trading which has an Iranian nexus do so with caution and very careful, with very enhanced due diligence.
Very good advice for once we sort of move further out of this current situation. Menelaus, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our listeners.
Thank you very much, Marcus. It's been a pleasure to speak to you all.
Thank you for listening to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, and we look forward to joining you on our next episode.